Hello, and thank you very much for coming along once again. Today we're going to look a little bit more at the question of the first 200 years of the slave trade. We've been very versed on the last 200 years because they're dominated by people in the English-speaking world and the French-speaking world, which we have access to easily enough through our usual availability of high school and college language facility. But in many cases we don't know Portuguese, we don't know Dutch, and many of us know Spanish, but we haven't looked at the late medieval Spanish archives, don't have access to them very easily. And for that reason we need to start looking across national boundaries and inviting scholars who are experts in these languages to join our seminars, as it were, and join the public discussion in the English-speaking world. So that's what we're going to look at today, and particularly focus not so much on the Portuguese and the Spanish, but on the Dutch, who have been left out of most of our discussions of the slave trade. So we're going to look at this whole question of what do we really know about the first 200 years of the Atlantic trade in Africa. And particularly, what do we know about the Dutch and their enduring influence, both in West Africa and, as it turns out, in the New World, in ways that we haven't spent a lot of time discussing? Well, the last time we talked a little bit about the fact that they had emerged in the Asian trade because of the superiority of their ships and the capacity for military conquest at sea. They were able to displace the Portuguese, who had first arrived in the Asian trade and dominated the early years of it. But the Dutch began to explore other parts of the world, and particularly North America. They settled New Amsterdam, that is the current area of what we know as New York. If you look at the early maps, the Dutch maps in particular, they have a great deal of detail right up through New England in all of these areas, and especially starting with information about New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam becomes what we now know as New York. The Dutch created a fort on an island of Manhattan in the New World, and developed a small colony of settlers on the Hudson River as far north as Albany. This Dutch outpost was traded to the English in the late 17th century in exchange for Dutch dominance in the Spice Islands in the Banda island chain in Indonesia. The Dutch so prized the Spice Islands and the trade in nutmeg in particular, that they traded this colony, this fort down here, which you can see at the tip of Manhattan, and their walled protection along Wall Street, as it became known. This whole colony was traded to the English at the end of a military encounter at the end of the 17th century. If it hadn't been for that, we'd still be Dutch in New York. It's very extraordinary as a history. The Dutch actually employed Henry Hudson, an Englishman, to do the initial navigation. Take a look.
Henry Hudson, an Englishman working for the Dutch, in this little Dutch ship called the Half Moon. It was only 85 feet long. He's exploring the east coast of North America. He pokes his nose into New York Harbor, what is today New York Harbor. He spies the river that now bears his name and sails north of it, expecting to find Asia. Well, we know that the Hudson River doesn't take you to China. Disappointed, he leaves and goes back home to Europe. Little did he know that as the result of his explorations, the Dutch would found a territory that would stretch from Delaware Bay at the southern end of today's New Jersey to the Connecticut River, and at its center, its most important node of activity, the Hudson River Valley, and the two cities they found to cap it at the northern end, Beaverwick, we call it Albany, and at its southern end, New Amsterdam, on that island across the bay. Hi, I'm Barry Lewis. Welcome to Dutch New York.
Well, we're not going to go into the history of Dutch New York here, but let's emphasize the fact that we are, in effect, a colony of a lot of European initiatives on the North American coast. And the Dutch were very prominent. In fact, most of the naming of the area around Harlem and Brooklyn itself and Staten Island, all these are Dutch names. We can look into this in further detail in the future if you're interested, but the fact is that they were a Dutch colony before they were an English colony, and they were dominated by the Dutch for a long period of time. So, if we take a look at that, it's fascinating to see what other parts of the world came under Dutch influence at the time. The maritime trade they engaged in high weight and value options, that is, high value to weight options and items, extended to buying and selling slaves from Africa to the Americas. There was an acute labor shortage in America for newly established plantations, and the Dutch got pretty good at supplying that trade. Take a look.
The Netherlands, a wealthy nation, densely populated and well known for its social tolerance. It is the European part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, which consists of the Netherlands Antilles, and Aruba in the Caribbean. But what is it that made the Netherlands one of the 10 richest nations in the world? Where did all that wealth come from? What is the origin of the Dutch royal family's fortune of an estimated $8 billion? Enter the Golden Age. The Dutch history books speak fondly about the era of great prosperity that spanned the 17th century. By 1750, the Netherlands was the foremost commercial and maritime power of Europe, turning Amsterdam from an insignificant fisherman town into the financial center of the world. It also represents the golden age of Dutch art, with painters like Rembrandt and Vermeer. Dominating the world trade, the Dutch established a great colonial empire and operated the largest fleet of merchants of all Western nations. Under supervision of the Dutch East India Company, huge profits returned from the East Indies. The Dutch soon governed their territories in order to maintain the trade. Less prominent in the Dutch history books is the story about the West India Company, the government-incorporated trading organization that would share the world trade with its East India counterpart. It is a dark chapter in the Dutch history, a story about how the Dutch enriched themselves through transatlantic slave trade, piracy, and smuggling. The West India Company was founded in 1621 and was given authority to conduct business and military action in West Africa and the Americas.
Okay, now it's important to remember those dates. The West Indian Company, the Dutch West Indian Company, was established after the Dutch East Indian Company. The Dutch East Indian Company was the first joint stock company in human history, set up in 1607, 1608. By 1621, a year after the Pilgrims settled in Plymouth, 1621 they set up the Dutch West India Company, which is authorized to take military control and create a presence on the coast of West Africa. It's here we start looking at the Dutch maps very carefully.
Initially trading tobacco, sugar, and gold, the Dutch soon excelled in the trading of African slaves. Although the West India Company formally did not engage in slave trading prior to 1630, in 1619 American colonist John Smith recorded, "About the last of August came a Dutchman, that sold us 20 Negroes. The ships of the West India Company sailed a route that became known as the Triangular Voyage. This journey started in one of the many Dutch harbors and took the ships to the Dutch ports on the African Gold Coast. Slaves were bought or traded, and as many as 700 African slaves were loaded as merchandise in each ship and were referred to as heads, as in heads of cattle. From Africa, the ships would cross the Atlantic, sailing towards the island of Curaçao, the Dutch colony that had grown into the biggest slave depot in the Caribbean by the 1650s. The hard conditions on board, poor nutrition, and disease caused a 20% death rate among the enslaved Africans. In the reported tragedy of 1738, the Dutch slave ship Leusden sinks off of the Suriname coast. As the crew heads for the lifeboats, 702 of the 716 slaves aboard drowned, locked into the below deck. For those who made it, their future didn't seem a lot better. The weaker slaves were usually auctioned off early. The prime slaves were sold individually to the highest bidder, separated from their families. They were sold for about $100 each, and merchants would ship them to the plantation in Suriname, Brazil, and other colonies, facing a life of endless, forced, hard labor. After the ships were loaded with sugar, gold, or tobacco, they returned to the Netherlands, making the triangular voyage complete. Although the Dutch history books repeatedly tell us the profits from slave trading were minimal, eventually many ships returned without cargo. The profits were so high the merchants didn't even bother to reload their ships at all. After the monopoly of the West India Company and the transatlantic trade had ended, the Middelburg Commercial Company and the West India Company caused the Dutch to dominate the transatlantic slave trade from 1750 to 1775. In this period, the Netherlands became the #1 supplier of slaves to Spanish colonies in the Americas.
Okay, now this is absolutely crucial, but not very well understood. During this period, the 18th century, 1750 to 1775, according to this documentary, the Dutch became the principal suppliers of slaves to the Spanish colonies in America. Now, keep in mind that 90% of those transferred from Africa to the Americas never came to North America. It was Spanish America and the Caribbean that was the destination of 90% of the cargo from West Africa. And the Dutch are the dominant purveyors of slaves to the Spanish colonies. Accounting for 90% of the population, this is a pretty big omission in our understanding of the slave trade. We tend to think it has to do with bringing individuals to North America for plantation work. Not quite. We need to relook at the entire Caribbean and Spanish territories and the role of the Dutch in this process.
The Dutch slave trade, piracy and smuggling enriched the reigning Dutch royal family. In the early 17th century, Prince Frederik Hendrik orders the construction of many palaces and builds up an astonishing art collection. Formerly, Prince Willem V was the last member of the Dutch royalty who profited substantially from the slave trade, up to the early 19th century. In 1814, the Kingdom of the Netherlands officially ends its participation in the Atlantic slave trade, partially because of the declining profits. But slavery in the Dutch colonies is not abolished until 1863, the Netherlands being the last nation in Europe. Even up until 1873, the freed slaves are under government supervision, forced to work on the same plantations for a small salary to avoid the collapse of the Dutch sugar industry.
Well, this is fascinating documentary, and we ought to look into it more as part of the Dutch maritime trade in these valued objects, as it were. So one important new field in African history is being launched with the close digital examination of the historical texts and their printed maps. The printed maps of the Dutch of West Africa are among the richest in the world, And we can start to look at some of these in detail now and share them with each other in different academic traditions. We can call upon the Dutch to come to our assistance as they provided the maps for even these French journals. You'll see that these maps are often written in Dutch and then translated later into English. A lot of the early travel logs are written additionally in Dutch and translated then into English and into French, because the Dutch were there first in West Africa. And you can see it, in fact, from the air at this point. If you take a look at one of these maps and carefully realize that they're all over West Africa, you can zoom in on some of these maps in their detail and realize that places like Saint-Georges de Bina, established by the Portuguese in 1482, is eventually taken over by the Dutch. And you can actually, with Google Earth, parachute into these places that exist now on the coast of Ghana, what we can now call Ghana. This is a very interesting aspect of the current means of using electronic technology to share information. Let's take a look, in fact, at what these things look like. You can see they're visible from space, but you can also walk around them and see how huge they are. They are enormous medieval castles built for the sole purpose of promoting the slave trade. Now, Elmina was first established by the Portuguese, but eventually it's occupied by the Dutch, and they make it a major feature of their international slave trade effort. In fact, if you look at these ramparts, you can realize that they're looking out to the ocean, and their big defenses are aimed at potential rivals coming to challenge them from the ocean, not from the land. In fact, their cannons are usually set up in such a way as to look out to the ocean. You can actually travel around and take a little tour of the interior of these castles. Look at the dungeons in which the slaves were kept before they were sent abroad on the transatlantic slave trade Middle Passage. Very important to start looking at these things, as it were, from space. They're formidable medieval castles in their own right, but when you start to look at the ways in which they were deployed and the ways in which, in the history of European maritime exchange, they're set up to shoot out to other European rivals, not to attack Africans, but to make sure that they have the lucrative toehold for the transatlantic trade. This is why these maps are becoming of supreme importance, and the Atlantic trade needs to be re-examined with the close forensic detail that we can now bring to archaeology and the study of maps. For the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the Dutch empires, we need to look at what do we really know about the first 200 years of the links between Africa and the Americas. In the English-speaking world, we don't know a whole lot. Scholars that do know about this exist in Dutch universities, in Spanish universities, in Portuguese universities. And we need to start using whatever skills we have on the internet to exchange the information with them and learn from them about mapping the slave trade.